Thanks very much for coming, everybody here in person in the room, and also those who are joining online. My name is Chico Ferreira. I'm very happy to be sharing today's seminar by two people very close to the III, Rafael Carranza and Berkay Ozcan, entitled The Concentration of Children Over Time and Its Consequences for Income Inequality and Poverty. They probably don't need an introduction in this group, but Berkay is a professor of social and public policy here at LSE and the Faculty of Social at the III. Rafael is an assistant professor at the School of Government at the Catholic University of Chile and a visiting fellow at the III. You know the drill. There'll be a chance to ask questions. Normally, economists like these two like being interrupted during the talk, but this is a bit complicated online. I'll let Berkay manage that himself. But if he doesn't see you and take your question, then hold it for the end, please. Okay, Berkay, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chico, for the introduction. I should say that I don't see anyone in the room, so I won't be able to see hands. So if you need to interrupt me, you have to shout or say, hey, I have a question. I also don't see the people on the wait room either online, so it's same applies to them too. So first of all, thank you so much for having me over for the seminar series. The plan was being there in person, and unfortunately I couldn't be there. And this has been a work in progress that Rafael and I have worked through last year, much of the work. And we both had to give a long interruption to this work because I moved to Abu Dhabi for this year and Rafael has moved to Chile. And with these two big moves, we have to give an interruption. So this seminar really helps us to wrap our heads around the question and get some feedback about the direction that this project will take place. And we are hoping to produce multiple papers out of this project. So this is kind of the setting the ground, a descriptive work. And the title is long, but we want the title to be as descriptive as possible. It's the concentration of children across the income distribution over time and its consequences for income inequality and poverty. This is actually quite an old question, the relationship between income and fertility. The question whether rich people have more children than poor people goes back to actually old writings of the Malthus in the 18th century. And if the assumption of the children are being normal good, economists used to tell that more money means having more children. However, empirical work shows a negative correlation between income and fertility, both within countries and between countries. And here is a graph from Matthias Dobke from LSE's Econ department. Our colleague recently published in 2023 book, Handbook of Family Economics, where he updated the latest work by Jonas and Turtle to show that across the cohorts, the negative correlation has been already flattened in 1948 cohort over the income points deciles. The fertility differentials have been almost zeroed in that cohort. And since then, many other studies up until late 1990s trying to understand the differentials of fertility, but negative relationship between income and fertility has been detected to be disappearing, albeit there's no positive correlation between fertility and income. So since Becker, economists have produced many theoretical models explaining why there's no positive correlation, despite the fact that we assume children are normal good and more money means more children. One explanation was the famous Beckerian quantity-quality trade-off, where people become richer. They would want quality children rather than quantity children, and that would produce a negative correlation. And other theories talked about wives and husband-wives earning differentials getting narrower, meaning that wives' preferences dominate over the number of children over the decades, or human capital accumulation interruptions might affect the number of children too. So these are some of the theories trying to explain the lack of positive correlation. However, actually, economic historians and demographers have identified positive correlations in particular conditions, such as very low-income countries. We have seen in the DHS data Zimbabwe and some of the sub-Saharan African countries are observing a positive correlation between income and fertility. And also in old data sets in Europe, especially in the 19th century in France, for example, they have observed for a period where there's a positive correlation. When you look at the micro studies, when at the individual level, there are plenty of studies that show there's positive correlation or positive effect causal effect of income on individuals' fertility decisions and fertility outcomes. For example, people have looked at the lottery winnings or temporary income shifts or the negative income shocks that reduce the fertility too. So large literature that shows at the individual level, there is some positive causal effect of income on the fertility. And moreover, again, the Dobke's recent book argued that the negative correlation has also largely disappeared, even though surprisingly no evidence of positive correlation have been shown like across the high income countries. There's some suggestive evidence at the country level, but not within the countries, and very few studies on income and fertility relationship in the last 15 years. I want to highlight this point, the 15 years, very important, because since 2010, actually globally, we entered a very lowest low fertility era. A lot of countries have seen, traditional countries have seen a dramatic decline in fertility. Even post-pandemic, the declines have been so dramatic. Actually, yesterday, all the British newspapers were highlighting the fact that the UK total fertility rate just released this week is the historically low, at the lowest point since 1938, which is the time when they started recording the total fertility rate. So there's very few studies on income and fertility relationship in the last 15 years. This is considered to be an old topic left pre-recession period. And a few random studies looked at the income and fertility study like relationship in a single country study. Sweden, US, and France are the three studies that we know. They are interested in the other way around in the causality, and then they try to understand at the individual level what's happening. So given this picture, what we have these reversal in the correlation of income and fertility across the countries from 1980s to 2000s, but we don't have the recent data, what's going on in the reversal in the income and fertility relationship either at the between the country level. So what we do, we decided to ask the basic question, what happened, especially taken into account in the last 15 years? Where are the children in the household income distribution now? Are children more likely to happen in the rich, poor, or middle families? This is important to ask because now we are globally in the low fertility rate. So there's a lot of question about presence of children versus absence of children rather than the number of children. And we'll come back to this issue a bit later when we talk about the concentration indices. And these are the tools that we propose using them to understand both childlessness and also the higher parity. I have omitted the substrand of the literature that discussed why like the socioeconomic gradient of the childlessness and which type of households become childless at the end. There are individual studies out there, but those studies are concerned in the zeros distribution rather than having high number of children. So we wanted to look at full income distribution across a set of countries, and we want to look at not only childlessness, but also the larger number of children, and to first describe where they are concentrated in the income distribution. We will be showing that in majority of the countries over the 30 years, the concentration has gone up. They are more likely to appear in the upper parts of the income distribution. And we want to compare a large set of OECD countries over time to establish the basic trends. And then we want to move on to discuss what are the effects and implications of such concentration on household income inequality, poverty, and child poverty. And we will be using some novel methods of risk regressions to produce some counterfactual distributions. So by doing so, we contribute two strands of literature. One of the old literature is about fertility differentials. And this literature has been studied by macroeconomists and demographers in different ways. And they were interested in how they relate to inequality and poverty by demographers and economic growth by macroeconomists. The prominent focus on the fertility differentials have been on education. If you look at the existing studies, they look at high educated women, low educated women, what are the fertility differentials in which countries, and how these education or income differences up until 1980s produce different growth rates. And there are only a handful of recent studies that look at the dynamics of these things, such as Kuznets curves of fertility over demographic transitions. And these demographic papers are interested in also the relationship between economic growth and fertility. There's a separate literature, and that's mostly sociologists have studied, and that's about how much family structure changes over time, such as in the last 30 years, we have increasing single-headed households, increased divorce rates, reduced fertility, all sorts of family structure changes altogether account for the increase in inequality. In this accounting exercise, majority of the researchers have focused on the single mothers, cohabitation and marriage than actually fertility and children. There's one notable exception, Bruce Western and Deirdre Bloom and Christine Porcheski paper in 2008, that looked at the differences between households with children and without children, and how much of the total inequality has been can be accounted by the increases in inequality among the households with children and among the households without children. And their paper relies on decomposing the variance function decompositions, which are looking at either predicted or variance income, which we argue that that's not actually the measure of inequality per se. So after this background and like explaining what we do, I want to go through directly what the data looks like and then give you a long set of slides with graphs and charts, and we'll talk about them. So we use Luxembourg Income Studies data, and we observe the countries in two time points. One of them is around 1990s, and which is some countries have the earliest in 1984, and some come to 1994, and median is 1987. And then we observe them again 30 years later, around in 2020. So the median being 2019. We wanted to observe these data sets before the pandemic, because pandemic might have changed a bunch of things. And our focus here are the children age 14 or younger, which are the international definition of the children according to PISA dataset. But it's instrumental for us. We wanted to account for households where the children are present in these countries across the income datasets, where children cannot bring extra income to the households. So the children can be considered as people in the households that are contributing to consumption of the household, but they are not contributing to the income of the household. So we can discuss about what should be the right age cutoff for the children, but for now, all the analysis we have done are like age 15 or like less than 15 years old. So the final sample includes countries with data on factor income. And I think Rafael can correct me, but I think this is our definition of what we call market income in the list jargon. And we focus on the number of children for 2 periods. And we have 24 countries in the data set. So as I said, we first start with assessing the position of the children in income distribution using concentration indices. Concentration indices are actually indices that help us to understand how the burdens or benefits are distributed over the units, how they're concentrated across the distribution of something. And if you think about it, Gini is a specific case of a concentration index. And these are very similar to the Gini, but in this particular case, it's a bivariate measure that helps us to look at the concentration of children ranked by the income. And we use total household factor income, which is market income, that includes, according to list definition, labor income, capital income, pension income, and fringe benefits and own consumption. Rafael can correct me if this is wrong, but the bullet point 4 is actually very small, and very few people have actually reported it. And to be honest, I don't know what actually is consisted of, but we stick to the list market of income definition. Yeah. Sorry.
Sorry. Can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
So, so you have pension in there and some benefits.
That's right.
But when you say market income, you mean it's gross of taxes, or it's
That's
not?
right. That's right. Gross of taxes.
Gross of taxes, but with benefits and pensions.
So the fringe benefits and own consumption are not the benefits in the sense that we understand the benefits.
Oh.
So that's why I refer to this question to Rafael, because he tells me that this is a list definition of market income without the benefits that has to be included in it. And very few observations have actually this category inside. We don't have any other welfare transfers in the income definition. We don't have taxes. We don't have benefits. Pensions are the only ones when it comes to benefits.
So basically gross income.
It's basically gross income. And
of course, using total household income, of course, makes a difference relative to per capita or equivalized or something, as I'm sure you've discussed at length.
That's right. That's right.
And I can see why you would choose total, but you're gonna tell us a little bit about that. Are you?
That's right. So we wanted to look at the market income differences because we wanted to understand whether people are able to have a child based on their market income distribution. And then once we look at the disposable income, I will show the graphs on that too, the concentration of children becomes even larger. This will give us some possibility to discuss about what role welfare states actually play once we introduce taxes and transfers in the income definition, how that much the concentration actually moves. So I'll come back to this. I think this is important. So thanks for reminding. So we use main tool, descriptive tool, as concentration indices, a function of number of children and the income rank relative to the average number of children. So we have the formula here that's based on the covariance, but you can write in different ways the concentration indices. And C is bounded between -1 and +1, unlike Gini. And when we have the negative, less than 0, concentration of children in that country happens at the bottom of the bottom part of the income distribution. And if it's 0, the children appears at equal shares across the income distribution. If it's positive, concentration of children happens more and more on the top of the income distribution. It's a similar interpretation to Gini. That's why we will be using some illustrative graphs, very similar to the Lorenz curve. But C does not depend on the shape of the income distribution. Income only provides here a ranking tool. So we picked up an example case here, Taiwan, just to illustrate the point, because it's one of the most dramatic points in our data sets. So Taiwan in 1986, the dark blue continuous line had a concentration almost 0.05. So it's following very closely the 45-degree dashed line. And by 2016, the line have moved away from the dashed line, making a curvature. And then it became like the red dotted line shows that an increasing concentration across the income distribution, which means that Taiwan had, like the children in Taiwan, increasingly concentrated above the higher part of the income distribution over the 30 years. And when we look at for all countries, over the market income or gross income, here that includes pensions too. So like in this graph that we show in majority of the countries compared to 1990, in 2020, children are more likely to be concentrated at the top. Concentration indices numbers are positive side of the 0, and then they have gone up, like within few exceptional countries like Denmark and Sweden, like have less concentration compared to 2020 now. But what is also interesting here is that Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden, whether in 1990 or in 2020, they have already at the market income, before the intervention of the welfare states, taxes or transfers, the children have been concentrated in the higher part of the upper part of the income distribution, dramatically more than the rest of the OECD countries. You see on the right upper part of the 4 countries, Norway, Finland, and Denmark. And we say that once we introduce the taxes and transfers and look at the disposable income after tax, we see concentration is even far more dramatic. And between these two graphs, the x-axis scale like almost doubles all the scale. So the concentration in these Scandinavian countries reaches to between 0.4 to 0.6. And many other countries shift now the other side in 2020 and increase concentration. This is obviously because a lot of benefits and transfers have been channeled through the families with children across the Europe over 30 years, because family policies are the areas that are expanded a lot over the 30 years. And then that might be one of the things that drive, but then there might be other things that might be driving the differences between market income and disposable income across the countries. So one of the things that could be driving is, as a demographer, you may say, fertility has been postponed more and more. If people are giving births in their late 30s compared to early 20s, which is when their income closer to the peaking periods, and we might naturally see aging populations are driving much of the effects. But we show that like once we do the adjustment by age, and I think we do an age adjustment based on the Solon's paper, and we do residualize after running a regression with age polynomials and use the residualized like version of the income by adjusting the age. We still see Scandinavian countries like Denmark, Finland, and Sweden on the far end and almost to the same level as the market income, and not much change in them, although a number of countries such as UK now shows a negative concentration of children in 1990 as well as in 2020. And this is interesting UK case because some of my colleagues, like Kitty Stewart, Aaron Reeves have this large families grant, and then there's big discussion about the larger families' likelihood of falling into poverty, where the benefits in the UK penalizing the families with the third child and above children. So we can see some hints in this data that the UK have the larger concentration of children that are on the bottom part of the income distribution, increasing likelihood of poverty for these families. But when we not only adjust by age, but also we restrict the age group to 60, I believe, Rafael, so just interrupt me if I'm wrong, we still see concentration of income plus adjusting, plus restricting the age. So we're confident that it's not the delay in fertility over 30 years to the age 30 doing the majority of the pattern here across between the countries, even though it is explaining quite a chunk of them because it moves the countries to lower concentration to higher concentration. But it's not the only thing that is driving the concentration of children in the upper part of the income distribution. And for sure, it's not the case for the Nordic countries. So we have on the very top, Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden. In these countries, children are more likely to be concentrated on the top part of the distribution. So you may say, why are you picking up 2 data points and showing us the differences in 2 data points? We want to look at the trends, year-by-year trends. And here we did some different definitions of income, and we looked at the concentration of children index, like concentration indices trends over time. So when we look at the disposable income, which is a top curve, gray triangles, as you can see, concentration has gone up dramatically. Although the factor income plus pensions, which is the gross income, you don't see that dramatic increase in concentration of children, still compared to pre-2000s, they're at a higher level, and there's some increase between 2015 to 2020. And once we age adjust them and age restrict the data, we kind of kill that trend for the US, at least for the last 10 years, and there's almost a flat line. But we see a dramatic change happened in late 1990s, and concentration of children becoming more and more likely happening on the upper part of the income distribution. So moving beyond the US, when we look at a number of other countries, we want to look at whether this is a pattern that is holding everywhere. It is not. Some countries actually have seen more dramatic increases, such as the UK, in the concentration of children in the income distribution, but their starting levels were low. And many of these countries have experienced a decrease in concentration up to mid-1995, and then the trends have reversed from then onwards. And USA and UK are on the bottom line, and then the Sweden and France have a bit of a mixed trends. So once we establish these trends of increasing concentration, we wanted to focus on the consequences of them. The first consequence, sorry, do you have a question? No. Sorry. So the first is the choice of equivalence scale becomes more critical. I think, Chico, this speaks to your concern. And the second is the estimates of inequality, total and child poverty are affected by this. And the third is the relative importance of household composition in much of the income inequality analysis that has dropped from the literature in the last 15 years. Let me walk through the choice of equivalence scales, why it becomes more critical. This is somewhat a technical issue and a mechanic issue, but it's worth paying attention because it hasn't been paid attention before. So equivalence scales are the tools to adjust the needs of different types of households across the income distribution when we are interested in understanding the living standards across the households, when we're trying to understand income inequality across the households. For example, households with children, households without children, households with disabilities, households without any member with a disability may have differences in their needs, and hence the incomes are often, typically in income inequality analysis, are adjusted by the equivalence scales. And equivalence scales can be translated into elasticities, which represents the power by which economic needs change in the households. And these elasticities illustrate us the different equivalence scale tools being used in the literature in terms of how severely they punish additional members of the households for their contribution of the economies of the scale in the household, in their consumption contribution and so on. So the first one, for example, per capita scale, where you would treat every child as any adult, and on the other extreme, where you treat every child as zero to contributing to consumption. And most studies use somewhere in between. So OECD scale varies across the household composition. So they give the coefficient of 1 to the first 2 adults, and then it's a decreasing coefficient over each member of the household. And children gets about 0.6 and 0.5. And square root is the official statistics in the US, and a bunch of Latin American countries use the square root as the equivalent scale tool for their official poverty inequality statistics. And it is a 0.5 elasticity to the household size. OECD scale elasticity depends on the household size and composition, and they affect how we publish official poverty and inequality studies. So in this case, we took the 2 extreme cases as well as intermediate cases and show what would happen to inequality. The 2 extreme cases are if we treat the total and the per capita, which means if we treat children as entirely zero added to the consumption level in the household, or added as much as an adult in the household. So we calculate on the y-axis the differences in the Gini coefficient between one definition of equivalent scale and another definition of the equivalent scale. And on the x-axis, we plot the concentration index, and we show that actually these differences in inequality estimates correlate positively with the concentration index. And like that correlation is alarming, and actually this summarizes much of what I wanted to say, because as you move on and more concentration of children on the upper part of the income distribution, you are more likely to see an underestimation and overestimation of inequality, depending on the equivalent scales that we use. So even when you pick up more similar and commonly used equivalent scales, such as square root in the US official statistics or OECD equivalent scales, you see the differences in Gini points are still correlated positively with concentration index, but the fit is not that tight. So we see much smaller differences here. So the preliminary conclusion from here is that concentration actually compresses the income distribution, and children are now, in the recent years, more concentrated at the top, so that higher income families see a larger equalization and distribution is more compressed at the top. In a way, put differently, we are saying that the cost of children and at the top or high income families are much more reduced or adjusted for than the cost of children at the different parts of the distribution. And equivalent scales with higher elasticities will see a higher decrease. So per capita income inequality is lower than total income inequality. And comparing the square root with the OECD modified scale is less clear in terms of which one actually does more adjustment. So once this is recognized, then we can move to understand how it affects the estimates of inequality, total and child poverty in the data. Just to establish the basic facts here in the next 3 slides, the income inequality has been growing in most countries. And although some countries, there's some reduction here, as you can see, the Gini based on the Gini coefficient. And so as child poverty has increased too, but it's not as clear what happened to the relative poverty in the data. And when you look at the correlation between children's concentration, we expect negative correlation between high concentration and the income inequality, which is true because when you look at on the right-hand side, countries where the highest concentration is, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, are the countries where we have seen a high concentration of children already. And sorry,
it's me again.
Of course.
Here. So, okay, so you did the equivalent scale thing, which was nice. And then you showed a bunch of child poverties and so on. Now which distribution are you using? Back to the total household income?
Yes, I think so. This is disposable, right, Rafael?
So the Gini is disposable and it's using the OECD scale. Concentration still over market income.
Market income, yeah.
So now we're looking at child poverty and inequality measured in terms of the OECD scale.
Yeah.
And disposable income.
That's right.
Okay.
So this is just to establish our prior, like how would these trends actually correlate with the concentration indices? And our expectation is there should be some negative correlation, and which is true because these countries where the children are highly concentrated, they tend to be also lower inequality countries in general, where we see Mexico, where the concentration is almost zero on the very top end of the income inequality. And with relative poverty, we see also the negative correlation. And for child poverty, very obviously, I mean, I think there's also something mechanistic about it, right? So if more and more children are born to the rich households, you would likely to see less and less child poverty. So what we wanted to understand what is behind these associations. First, the mechanical link, as I mentioned, lower inequality due to equalization, so that the choice of equivalence scales does that. And also there's poor households are having, or they are less likely to have children. So the key questions here are they related to the cost of children? If the low-income households or households that are in the lower part of the income distribution are not having children because the cost of children has gone up and they can't afford to have a children, then we might argue for a welfare gap and the role for social policies actually to intervene. And if it's preferences for children have changed, or there might be interactions of both, we won't be able to distinguish all of these things. But the interaction of these factors could diminish or reinforce the direct link between concentration and inequality. So one tool we have is the counterfactual simulations, which may capture the interaction in both dimensions. And we'll look at those now. So do income inequality and poverty change when children's concentration changes? So previous studies have typically used variance decompositions to understand that. However, the outcome has been still income, the variance of income, or sometimes prediction captures less inequality than the observed value. But the new literature had been relying on the risk-centered influence functions, which allow for different outcomes than just the variance of income or predicted income. We can look at the Gini and poverty directly. And they have this elegance of linear regression model to predict counterfactuals that makes it much nicer or intuitive for us to understand. So we propose two exercises for inequality and poverty. One of them is the cross-section exercise for all countries using the latest year, and then we look at the time series between 1970s and 2001 for the US. So the RIF regressions assess the sensitivity of a given feature to changes in covariates. They are close relatives of the quantile regressions. And like the RIF function is a distribution statistics on the outcome, which can be mean, variance, quantile, or something. And while the previous research had focused on the unconditional quantiles, and we have our colleagues at the LSE, Sarah Fletcher and Frank Cowell, had looked at the list of like influence functions for inequality indices, which are then expanded. And we have seen a booming applications in recent years, these regressions, and we use them as our basis for producing counterfactual RIFs. So where we use OECD equalized household income as the outcome measure, and our outcome function is basically Gini coefficient and poverty headcount ratios. And headcount ratios are defined as the poverty line with 60% of the benchmark median. And we look at the dummy for factor income quintiles interacted with the number of children in each income quintile. So we propose three counterfactual scenarios in which we assign all children to either bottom quintile, middle quintile, or top quintile. This is driven by the fact that when we look at our data, we see that counterfactual share of households with children, 20%, is very similar to what we observe in Sweden, Netherlands, or Germany. So it's kind of a realistic scenario. Imagine that we have all the children born in the bottom quintile and all the children born in the middle quintile or the top quintile. We don't change the average number of children, and we just changes their positions in the factor income distribution when we are producing these counterfactual plots. So on the cross-section here, on the x-axis, we show all the countries in the most recent data sets that we have in the list data. And on the x-axis, we have this estimated Gini coefficients based on all children being in the bottom, middle, or top of income distribution in that country. And the black dots are the current observed official Ginis in the list. So the first thing that is striking is if all children have been born in the bottom, we would see a much higher income inequality for a majority of the countries. Although there are some notable exceptions, such as Hungary, for example, or Chile. If we have assigned all children being in the middle, that is closest to what we see in the observed Gini in most countries. And if we had all the children born in the top of the income distribution, which would be similar to the saying that as if most countries had the Sweden distribution, and we would be seeing much higher income inequality in majority of the countries than what we observe now. So in a way, having the distribution of children similar to the distribution of Netherlands or Sweden would increase already observed inequality levels in majority of the countries in our data set. So when we look at the time trends, we do the same exercise over time, not only the cross-section. We picked up the US data because for which we had the most data points, and starting from 1970s. And what we see here, the observed Gini is the black line again, and that jump happened in the mid-1990s. And if all children were born in the middle, the observed inequality in the US would be much lower than, the inequality would be much lower than the currently observed inequality. But in the other scenarios where we had the children who were born in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, inequality would be much higher. And so as if they had the Swedish distribution or Netherlands distribution, inequality would be again much higher. So we do the same exercise with counterfactual for poverty. And clearly, poverty is really affected by the children being in the bottom in this case. And in all other scenarios, the observed poverty rates are higher than if the children were born in the middle or the top. The same happens for the trends. The observed poverty rates are currently higher than if the children had been born in the Swedish case or children had been born in the middle group. Only the scenario where the children are born in the lower part of the income distribution increases poverty dramatically. The level differences in poverty rates are very high in this US case. So this is we have come this far and we have decided to go multiple routes with this project. But before going to them, I just want to say what preliminary conclusions are. First of all, the effect sizes are incredibly substantive in these scenarios. The concentration of children really produces somewhere between 10 to 18% of Gini, solely due to the location of children in income distribution. And where children are born before the intervention of the welfare state on the market income distribution has a secular and independent effect on the inequality and poverty. Some of those effects goes through the mechanistic way, through the equivalence scales, and others might be more behavioral. And increasing concentration suggests a welfare gap. If children are becoming unattainable for the lower parts of the income distribution, there's some role and discussions about pronatality policies, for example, or support policies for families in the bottom part of the income distribution. And we want to look at the redistribution. Here we say family benefits, tax allowances, and so on. Once we look at the disposable income, the concentration is even higher. So on the cross-section, it appears regressive in a way that family benefits and policies are affecting income distribution in a way that helps more families that are better off. Although I recognize the fact that these policies sometimes have other goals, like either look at the life course dynamics, and also they might be having other goals such as achieving gender equality and so on. So we may not conclude in the fact, very clearly saying that these benefits and tax allowances and so on are regressive by nature without looking at the other dimensions. So this is where I finish. And what we want to do in the next is look at generalized concentration curves to understand how many times actually or quantified effect of an absolute number of children increases compared to absolute number of children rather than relative ones. And we want to look at actual benefits based on list data and say a bit more about how much these transfers and benefits affects these concentration and inequality estimates. And we have thought a bunch of other ways that this study can go, and we are at the moment deciding about them. So I look forward to hearing your comments and suggestions, what would be most interesting for you to take from here onwards. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Berkay. That was great. Questions?
Shall I stop sharing, or would I be?
No, why don't you stop sharing? If people want to see specific graphs, you may.
Okay.
But otherwise, George.
Thank you, Professor Berkay. I really enjoyed your talk. And I can see the significance of it when we look at different countries. I was wondering, would there be a possibility to nuance the question of income with other factors that would contribute to, for example, fertility decline or fertility rise? I have in mind, for example, state policy and gender relations, where you find countries like Japan and so on, and South Korea, because of the declining fertility rate, they are offering incentives to women to move from rural areas to, move from urban areas to rural areas and get settled to have children. So state policy can contribute, perhaps. That will be something to look into. And then I also realized from my own work in India that religion and culture play a significant role in the rise of fertility, in relation to fertility. And that we could also see in like places like where Catholic population, like Northern Ireland. Catholics had more children than Protestants. Therefore, religion plays an important role in deciding fertility there. And in India, because of the Hindu religious traditions, the need for male children drives, unless if a household has only female, then there is a kind of, to have until a male child is born. So, because that has to do with Hindu religious rites and things like that, And in villages where I did field work with the lower caste communities, even the high rate of infant mortality contributed to higher fertility rate, because they realized that many children might die, and therefore the need to have more children. So every household that I did field work in villages, where they had nine births were there. But the surviving children were just 3, because that community had such high rate of infant mortality because of poverty. So can we bring in these factors in analyzing that will further perhaps nuance income and see this other cultural and religious factors?
Okay, that's a hard one, so I'll let you take that first, and then we'll see if there are more.
So thank you so much for the question. I mean, one thing that I should have clarified a bit more is that we have Mexico and Chile as middle-income countries, but majority of the list data that we use come from high-income countries, where the infant mortality is like abysmally low, which is one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. And given that, we wanted to, I mean, I understand that there's big discussion among the demographers, look at the demographic transition and fertility rate decline in tandem with the increases and decreases in infant mortality. That's for sure. But the period that we wanted to focus on, that is a kind of a clean and isolated period where we don't see these issues among a set of countries where the infant mortality is not the case anymore. Maybe in a future direction, a good suggestion is that if Rafaela and I can put our hands into data sets such as demographic and health surveys that include a lot more low-income countries where infant mortality is high, then we might want to look at the births rather than live births and other things, and things may be slightly more clear. Also, when it comes to preferences, I didn't say much about it, but there's one possibility to identify whether the preferences are changing or not. We can actually obtain data sets to look at the ideal number of children to see whether the concentration of the preferred number of children has also changed in addition to actual number of children having. That might allow us to disentangle whether they're able to have or they don't prefer to have question a bit more. So that's one of the future directions that we want to look into. So thank you.
Paulo, let me group a few now. So Paulo.
Yes, thanks. Very insightful presentation. I have a very simple curiosity, which all the presentation and the graph have been shown in terms of average number of children per income quantile. But then one wonder whether inside each quantile, the distribution that delivers that average amount different shapes. I mean, it can be that, for example, there is a bimodal distribution for low income because someone cannot afford and they simply decide not to have children. Someone else living in the countryside, they, for reasons that were pointed out, in previous questions, they simply decided they need 4 or 5 or 6 or as many as possible. So I wonder whether you found something or you're planning to investigate whether the full distribution of conditional on income it's different.
Are there any other questions at this point?
It's just a clarification question. It relates to the concentration index you're using. I'm just thinking how it is accounting for the fact that maybe households are having less kids. So the comparison between a household having 1 and many others having 4 or 5, which could be the case many years ago or some years ago, and now households moving to just 1 to 3 kids. How is the index accounting for that when you're doing this temporal analysis? So the gap between also the amount of kids.
Okay, why don't you take those 2 and then Jacob and I will go next.
So I would like to have Rafael to chip in to Pablo's question because I couldn't hear one part of it. But my understanding is what, I think Pablo was asking within the quantiles, the means being used as, and then that might be some non-linearities. Is that the question?
Yeah, the mean, the same mean could be the result of many possible distributions. So
yeah.
You mean, Paolo, within the quantile, for example?
Yes, I mean the conditional mean may be the same across quantiles, but then the distribution may differ. So I was wondering, this across country or within country. I mean, that I was puzzled by whether one can go straight forward to the mean, assuming that this does not hide any important source of heterogeneity in the phenomenon of having children. That's it. That was.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, and good to see you, or at least the ones I see on the screen. I think the main question there is that we've been thinking how to best model this, how to best account for the distribution of children across the income distribution. One way to do it would be, instead of assigning children to a certain quintile, is saying, well, what happens if we use, for example, the distribution of children of Sweden or any specific country that has a very particular distribution? That's one way to do it. That still would hide away any within differences you see for that given country. But I mean, this is something we've been trying to think on, how to best model the full distribution of children across the income distribution. So if you have any suggestions, they're definitely welcome. So
for the second question, I think we have been just discussing today with Rafael, using the generalized concentration curves would answer what you were asking. These are looking at the proportional changes and shifts as concentration curves, and we might want to look at the absolute changes from 4 children to 1 children, because we are in a very low fertility setting. But I usually get more questions around these lines, and people are asking, what is it driven by the having a 3rd child or having the 5th child, or like the zeros being inflated, having more and more childless households happening. So we have done a bunch of extra analysis, which I didn't show the slides, and I'm happy to show if need be. And even when you look at the concentration of among the households where they condition on having children, over time, we see the similar trends across the years. For some reason, I can't just go further with my slides here in the screen, but there's a bunch of graphs that I can show you later. But you're right, absolutely. The right tool wouldn't be the concentration index, but it will be the generalized concentration index to take into changes for the right quantifying the policy figures.
Thanks.
Yeah, just a little comment on Paolo's question and your answer to it is, of course, when you do the RIF regressions or even the concentrations, you're not looking at means in large groups, right? You're looking at fairly narrow quantiles. And so in that sense, you see that there. But what you could also do is sort of go down an integration level or something and show a sort of a density or an incidence curve of children across the distribution. Just plot the average number of children at each quantile. That is, of course, going to be changing changing both in absolute terms, as Amaya was saying, but also give you an overall sense,
Yeah.
if you want to see that. A question from Jakob, and then one there, and then one from me.
Yeah, thanks, Berkay. Thanks, Raphael. So one question just on the definitions and how to interpret the results. So definition of child and then also childless household means any household that doesn't have a child that is currently 0 to 14. So if they have a child age 15, they are childless by definition, basically. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so
So
how sensitive your results are just to also altering, you know, the age of the children, also because in many countries that we have included, there will be quite a lot of variation, I guess, even with adult children in the household still present or older ones, and then other countries where they move out earlier. For 0 to 14, that probably doesn't really play a huge role. And then also, just in terms of other results, I'd be interested in seeing, I mean, you already hinted at some of the what you call mechanistic results related, for example, to the equivalence scale. So I was just wondering if you had actually just done the sensitivity analysis on altering the definitions of, you know, equivalence scales or what income you are using, which poverty lines you. So, you know, all these kind of questions, because you hinted at this, but I was thinking that's probably fairly easy to do to see if your hunch there is correct or there might be other interesting stuff going on there. Thanks.
So yeah, so Jakob, thanks. Can I answer or not? Or
you have to group them, so we take one
Okay.
more.
Yeah, it is about the beginning of your talk. You said that you are considering on exploiting this data set more for further research. And I was wondering if you have in mind to consider the dynamics effects of concentration in children in the economy when you link this higher concentration to the inequality and poverty rates. Because I suppose that this concentration has some also economics effects like lower labor force in the future generations, which also will affect inequality. So if you are considering these dynamics in the future.
In fact, there's a lovely model to be written about that, I think. So yes. Why don't you take those two, and then Philippe van Kerm, who's online, and I will come last.
sorry, so just there had been a lag, so couldn't hear the last words, Chico.
I said, please go ahead and answer those two questions.
Okay, sorry. So thank you so much for the questions. Jakob, Raphael and I have produced a bunch of graphs. I was trying to play with it, like, why am I stuck on the slides? And we have a bunch of extra slides that what I could show about the increasing concentration, even when we change the definition of what the child is and what the sample is. There are two things happening with the age. One of them is, whenever I presented this, I presented twice in front of the demographer audience. People are interested in hearing, well, in Italy, the children are emancipating from their households at the age of 29 and they're still living with the parents. Are they children or are they adults? Like, our main criteria was, can we have children that they don't contribute with income, or they have no potential of contribution with income? So our age 14 and below comes from there. And you're right. So we don't have actual fertility data. This is not about fertility. This is about where children are present in the households. So we could look at the households with smaller children, but then that's going to be fairly driven by where the country is on the demographic transition. And also, even on the current rates, what would be the denominator in the age groups? So if you want to include all the ages, when you look at the concentration of children, you're likely to have some countries have much older households where the children are gone from the home and the households without any children, and they might be inflating the denominator in a way. So we looked at these exercises where we cut off the sample to 60, and then say all countries cut off at the 60, and then do we see the pattern? The patterns are extremely similar. In addition to, like, does this answer, Jakob, your question? I might be missing some part of it.
Yeah, no, good for now. I'll check out those other graphs you have at some point.
Okay, yeah, so the second question was about future research, looking at the dynamics for the what happens to the economy. I mean, that's a very interesting question. I just don't know how to. Maybe, Raphael, you have a better idea about how to incorporate these dynamics into what happens to the economy. And Chico was suggesting a paper when I cut off for a few seconds, so I couldn't hear what that paper was about. But I'm hoping that there are good studies that could guide us outside. When it comes to social mobility effects. If we think that children are more likely to be born in the upper parts of the income distribution, one obvious implication is not only the cross-sectional child poverty, but their life chances are better, right? So you are more likely to see them getting better education, less involvement in crime, and like more likely to be having better life chances overall. And one needs to counterbalance this with the argument that where other families where they can't afford to have children, and what is the welfare gap that we are having there, and one needs to think about it. So there's definitely a lot of effects of it, and we have this cross-sectional data, and to think about the dynamic effects, I don't have immediately clear pathway in my mind how we would target that, but I'm all ears if you have good ideas.
Thank you. If Rafa is not coming in, maybe we go to Philippe Van Kerm, who's online.
Yep. Hey, thanks very much for the nice talk, Berkay, and nice to see you all from far away. By the way, yeah, from here. Can you read that?
Wonderful.
Right. Yeah, it's very nice. No, I just have a clarification question on your risk regression analysis. So I didn't quite understand whether the simulations were based on quintile risk regression analysis or whether you directly were using risk on the influence function on the Gini or child poverty. And then that's the first thing. And the other one is then is what you try to control in those regressions. I mean, did you include age, which seems to be the easiest way to adjust for variation in the timing of fertility, and I don't know, education and occupation and that sort of things, which is why risk regressions are useful, because you can easily control for those sort of things, which is much less convenient in simulation approaches. So I wasn't quite sure what you did here.
And mine, if you could lump it together with that one, Berkay, I don't know if you can go back in your slides. I know you cannot go forward.
For some reason I'm stuck. Let me try. So nothing works. I'm clicking on things and it's not
even back. Okay.
Not even that. So,
but you had these graphs where you were doing, I think they were the results of the counterfactuals of the riff regression, and you had, the middle. If the children were in the middle of the distribution, it looked more or less like the Rio Gini, and then inequality went up if the children were born in the top or the bottom. Yeah,
that's right. So
confused about it going up if we move all the children to the top. There must be something about the equivalence scales going on, no? Because if you're dividing by a larger number and you move all the children to the top and you take them away from the middle, then inequality should go down. So is this something to do with whatever specific equivalence scale you're using in that one? Or
that's what I thought, that our prior was basically the poverty, like inequality, would be going down. Let me try to find those slides. Rafael, do you mind just meanwhile addressing these questions?
Improvise. No, yeah, I mean, just on Philip's questions, this is right, the riff on the Gini directly or the poverty rate directly. On the right-hand side, you have the quintiles. So that's how we look at how the number of children is related to, say, the Gini across different quintiles. And that's one thing related to Paolo's question, that we're not sure if that's the best way to do it or what's the best way to account for the distribution of children. But that's an open question. These are very straightforward regressions in that they don't control for anything, but definitely, I mean, the next step is to control for certain things, particularly age, I would think could be important. And regarding Chico's comment, it's true, we were expecting inequality to go down because of the equivalence scales, but you also have what Berkay mentioned as a behavioral effect. So basically, the correlations, the beta coefficients are positive in that case, for example. So moving children up in the income distribution, you'll find that the Gini goes up in those countries. So there's something going on over there that's not related to the equivalence scale.
Okay, that's really interesting, and it links to the following extremely quick follow-up, which is, once you've done these riffs, right? If you do them at your 2 points in time, then it's very natural to think of a sort of generalized Oaxaca blinder type decomposition where you separate the change between the composition, in this case, the axis, the number of children, and changes in the beta, right? So it's like saying, I'm going to move all of the people to high education, but I'm going to keep the betas as they are today. Obviously, that's going to, there's going to be some response to that, right? But that's a issue we all have in these kinds of literatures, but you could address those, at least discuss them a bit, maybe, or actually do the decomposition in this case. And
yeah, definitely.
And then a final point, deliberately abusing my prerogative as chair, but following on the question about, what was happening, Berkay, I was not referring to a paper that exists, but to one that I think you guys should write.
Okay.
Imagine that there is a Becker-Tomes model, where you invest in the future generation, depending on their returns.
Yes.
Now, two things happening. But you have imperfect capital markets. So there are two technologies. The poor can invest in a less efficient education technology. They cannot get their kids to the Russell Group universities or Ivy League. The rich can. Okay.
Yeah.
Now imagine returns to education are rising. Then I would imagine that the rich would want to invest in children much more than the poor, right?
That's right.
So there could be mechanisms like that going on.
For the closing fertility differentials, there is actually a bunch of studies pointing to what you have just said to me. And actually, there's one Nezek-Güner paper in 2005 tries to explain the returns of education being one of the drivers. There's some explanations about why the educational differentials have been closed off based on the returns of education and investment. So these models are explaining why the negative correlation has been collapsed, but they don't explain why we don't observe any positive relationship anymore in the data empirically. And majority of the studies that try to understand the growth mechanisms have tried to use education investments as the main mechanisms. They are from pre-recession to pre-2008. In the recent decade, I haven't seen any attempt to do it, but there might be a good reason to replicate some of those studies with the recent data. So it's a good suggestion. Thank you so much.
Well, and here we must end. It's already past time a little bit. So please join me in thanking Berkay and Raphael again.